Joey, I saw where Biden
Yes, he did pass the emergency declaration.
Disaster, but, and I don't know if the governor's office is working with FEMA on this. I hope they are. A number of parishes that were hammered were left off of that list of 23.
I looked, the list was pretty abbreviated compared to the damage, the ag damage that was sustained. And
that's kind of concerning, you know, why those parishes, are they still in the process of being evaluated, or?
I would think so. Because that freeze did not activate our incident command, I've not been privy to a lot of the discussion that's happened outside of the obvious. Naveen and the Ag Center might know, and I talk to NRCS as frequently as I can. But yeah, on that list of affected parishes, not all the ag parishes that need help were there. That's for sure.
You look at Jackson, Lincoln, let's see, Union, three major Morehouse ag parishes that were extremely impacted were not included in that list.
I agree. But it's a first step. We'll see what it looks like before the end of the week, because I think it may change by then.
Lindsay, I'll just depend on you to let us know when we're ready.
Yeah, let's wait maybe one or two more minutes to see if other people can trickle on.
Yeah, the late lunch crowd hadn't wandered in yet.
Take a long lunch.
That's right.
Joey, quick question.
Hey, Naveen, yeah.
On that template that was sent in the email, we pulled together some literature on those management activities and the carbon sequestration that was in the literature. I was thinking of sending it to you guys, but do you want me to add it there, or just send it to the group and then Ron and his team can take a look at it, or how do you?
Are you talking about one of the proposed action templates, Naveen?
Right. Yes, the templates where it has. Yes.
Well, I guess, you know, kicking it around amongst the ag group and the little bunch of us that were talking the other day at a minimum, I think what we're going to need to do, in short, yes, we can talk about it. We're going to be getting to that point. There's going to be an opportunity for that on the agenda here. And for the sake of discussion, Naveen, you can go over it to any detail you want. And it might even be worth sending out. If it's something that we could view, Lindsay, we could talk about when we get to that. Maybe share your screen and just show us what you have. I mean, that would be fine.
That sounds good. Thanks.
And I'd have to guess, and there'll be opportunity for that discussion later. But as we start seeing these things, and the more of this people do, the more ideas they're going to have, and where some of these things may branch out and where some may collapse into each other. I don't want to diminish anything that Ron and Ben worked on, because I think it's a functional little work of art, but I can see where what I've worked on, minus several of the entry fields, is aligning very much with what he.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll reiterate what you just said. I mean, it just looks like mine, you know.
Yeah.
It was a good effort. I mean, yeah, they did great.
And Naveen, we'll have some great time to discuss that in our working sessions today.
Sounds good.
So it's great to hear that you've already got some ideas in place.
Wonderful.
And so with that, chairs, if you want to kick us off for our meeting, we can call to order.
Co-chair, why don't you take us off?
All right, co-chair. So Karen Gotro, serving with Joey Bro as the co-chair of the Agriculture, Forestry, Conservation, and Waste Committee. Our sector meeting We're calling it to order now. So Lindsay, if you can please call the roll.
Absolutely. Members, if you can just unmute yourself to verbally state your name for the record, that would be great. Joey Bro,
Here.
Karen Gotro,
Here.
Naveen Addison,
Here.
Buck Vandersteen. Don't see Buck yet. David Daigle. Ernest Girard.
Here.
Fran Harvey.
Here.
Great. I don't see Greg Grandy. Justin Kozak.
Here.
Kyla Shanae.
Here.
Michael Lindsay. Michael, I see you, but we didn't hear you. We'll let the record reflect Michael Lindsay's here, even though Michael, you might have some trouble with your audio. So we haven't heard you. John Petrie,
I'm here.
Robbie Toombs,
Here.
Ron Harrell,
Here.
and Yolanda Righteous.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Chairs, we do have a quorum.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. We had a great first meeting a little while back, and I'm excited to be working with a group of such expertise and that have worked together in many instances for many years. And that dynamic, I think, is very helpful to us. Today, I'm very excited that we will be starting to develop our overall strategies and actions that will lead to either emissions reductions or improvement in sinks. And Lindsay is going to walk us through that. So I know several of you have been brainstorming already, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and developing ideas with the group. So with that, Joey, I'll turn it over to you if you'd like to offer anything.
Sure. Can we have an approval of the current agenda? Has everyone had a chance to look at it?
I'll
Can I
make
get a
a motion
motion?
to approve. I'll make a motion to approve.
Second, Ernest.
Now, the minutes of our previous meeting, has everybody had a chance to look over those? Can I get a motion of approval for the minutes of the previous meeting?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes, Joey.
Thank you, Naveen. Second.
I'll
I'll
second.
second.
Go ahead. Justin, second.
All right. Next item on the agenda, Lindsay.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to lead us through just a brief presentation on the action and development process as shown in the agenda. Can everyone see my screen? I'm about to start the slide deck. Is that coming through for everyone? Okay, so in this meeting today, we're finally diving into the action development process and developing our strategies for our groups that I know everyone has long awaited. So there are some desired outcomes that I'd just like to start us teeing off here before we dive into the working session. We really want this meeting to be an opportunity for you all to discuss these broader ideas, these strategy and action ideas. And I'll be facilitating these discussions with leadership from our chairs, and Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute is on our call, and she'll be live note taking as we get into those working sessions. So she might just chime in and flag some clarifying questions for all of us. So we'll be able to visualize those ideas as we're working through them together today. So before we jump in, just wanted to set some desired outcomes. We'll first start by developing a draft list of sector related strategies. So these overarching broader categories for our committee. And this, I'm imagining, can take about 20 minutes for us to do. And then we'll dive into those strategies and break them down. Begin to think through those specific actions, the potential actions that might be inside of each of those strategies. And then after we lay out that thorough list, then assign a point person or maybe 2 or 3 people to develop the action proposal using the action template. And I'm hoping that we'll have a good amount of time for this discussion. We might not need all of it, but I think it's better to have more time than not. And then lastly, I'll close out just by providing some next steps and getting input from all of you on what it would be helpful to focus on in the April cross-sector workshop. So we just had that February all-hands meeting, and we'll have another in April, but wanted this to take more of a workshop shape instead of a big meeting everyone together. So I'll outline more what that looks like if we move through the agenda. I'll reiterate this a few times throughout our meeting today, but the goal at this stage is really brainstorming and broad thinking. Later on, we'll be able to group and split and further divide out what is an action and a strategy. But today, our focus is really on idea generation, not on constraints. So with that, I'm going to provide you all with a brief overview and revisit some of our action development process before we dive in. So in that February all-hands meeting, Colleen McHugh and I laid out the action development process and what that might look like. And we've gotten some really great questions from you all, from other committees, from the public as well since then. And so we wanted to just take some time and run through those questions we've received for a few minutes. And so some of those are around the process of submitting actions, what happens when my proposal is submitted, how are they evaluated and weighed, can I collaborate with your people, and then how are public submittals incorporated into the process. So first, to address this question about the process of submitting actions, wanted to just lay out the next few meeting schedules throughout the coming months for you all. In this March meeting, again, we're going to have a working session to brainstorm strategies and actions with the goal of creating a list of potential actions and giving some homework to you all who will draft those actions. In April, we'll have those cross-sector working sessions where we need those cross-disciplinary linkages. And the goal there will be to refine our action proposals with additional feedback from other groups. And then we have that April 30th deadline to submit proposals. This is for the public and for the committee members. And then in May, once we have all the submittals together, you guys will come back together in a meeting just like this and discuss the sector action proposals that we've received from the public and from committees with the goal of identifying gaps and highlighting common or different alternative approaches as well. And you all will have the opportunity to reconvene in August and work with the planning team to refine the actions based on feedback from advisory groups. So we know this is a heavy lift over the next 2 or 3 months, and it will require a significant amount of working with other members and collaboration and some homework. But this is the part of the process where we're really going to rely on your expertise as our sector committee. And we'll continue to engage you throughout the rest of the year, but noting that the heavy lift will be in these next couple of months. So a great question that we received from different members was on what happens to my action once the proposal is submitted. So I'll walk you through this step diagram. As you can tell, there are a lot of things that happen once an action gets submitted. So this is a great question that we wanted to address. So first, the public and sector committees and advisory groups will submit those actions, and we're going to provide regular updates to the Climate Task Force website with those proposals. We'll also send out an email to all the committee and advisory groups as we begin to receive those. I'm envisioning like a weekly or bi-weekly update on the website and to members as well. And then, as I mentioned in your May committee meeting, proposals will then be sorted into sectors and themes and discussed by you all in that meeting. It will also report out to the task force on all of the action proposals received in their meeting as well. And then we'll enter into this process of organizing all actions across strategies and sectors. This might require some combining or splitting. You might have to do some gap filling and grouping of different strategies that you have identified. So it's almost guaranteed that the actions there submitted in their template form might not stay the same as they go throughout the process. So we're ensuring that all of the actions speak to each other and work together to create a unified strategy vision. So after that organizing and development process, then you can see that actions and strategies will be organized into their hypothetical portfolios. And this is where we'll work with the task force and public to create these hypothetical portfolios. And the advisory groups then will provide an evaluation of portfolios against the fundamental objective. And this will be done primarily by the advisory groups, as I mentioned. And then committees will come back together in August to revise actions based on feedback from the advisory groups. Then we'll enter into that trade-off analysis where we're beginning to weigh the different impacts of our actions. And will be primarily the duty of the task force. And then the last stage, the task force will make decisions about the action portfolio that is put into the final report. So that's the overarching process of what happens when actions are submitted. Another question we've been asked about is if members should submit a series of related policies or tactics as one action template or multiple action templates. So since actions can be directly implemented, I think it's helpful to look at the implementation pathways to see if they're significantly similar or different. So as a reminder, these details include the time frame of implementation, the action leads and partners, what is the process for adopting and implementing the action and funding it as well. So if you're noticing that these are the same across some different action ideas we have, then maybe you could consider submitting as one program with a few different tactics within it. But if you find these implementation pathways look different, then you can submit separate action proposals for these. But I would just say that this is not our primary concern for today. We're mainly trying to focus on idea generation in this discussion. So ultimately, action proposals, as I mentioned, will be combined and work with others and split into multiple actions later in the process. But as you have questions that arise on this in your development of actions, please don't hesitate to let Holly or I know as those questions come up. Another question that we've received is on the collaboration, and people can collaborate on their action proposals. And I would say it's very much encouraged to collaborate on proposals where multiple groups are considering common approaches and common actions to the extent that you can agree on a unified implementation pathway. We really encourage you to work around action ideas. So for example, 2 or 3 members of this sector committee can work together around an action proposal, or you as a sector committee member might want to work with a local organization that's more expert in that area. You could work with 1 or 2 members of different sector committees where there are cross-sectoral strategies and actions, and multiple members of the public can work together as well. But I would just ask that you keep in mind, this is a public process, so the goal is not to organize full or big committee meetings outside of our official meetings, but to the point that you can collaborate with a few other members and experts. That's absolutely acceptable. But I would say if members can't agree on an approach or think multiple approaches to a similar idea should be evaluated, then that's quite all right as well. We can sort that out later in the trade-off analysis and in our evaluation of actions against our fundamental objectives. And so that evaluation phase will allow us to consider a broad range of ideas against our intended outcomes. And so with that, I would say that since we're evaluating against our objectives, several proposals that are submitted for the same action, or the same action will automatically score higher. So this is intended to remove the bias against popularity of proposals. So we don't want an action that has 12 identical action template proposals to be weighed higher than a different action that only has 1. So this is a way of leveling the playing field for us. And so with that, I'll take any questions that you all have on the action development process. Those were just the main ones that I have been receiving, but wanted to open it. If you guys have any further questions or questions as we go through development of the template, then I'll be happy to answer them as well. Okay, great. No questions. So moving on to our next agenda item, the crux of our meeting today, as I mentioned, will be two different working sessions. So we're going to first transition into the first working session based around sector strategies. Before we dive in, I just wanted to provide a few desired outcomes of this first working session. We really want to develop a draft list of sector-related strategies. So as we've talked about in past meetings, a strategy is a high-level path to reduce emissions. So we're going to start with a menu of potential strategies that our planning team has developed, really based on the conversation that you all had in the December meeting. A lot of you mentioned some great action ideas in that first meeting. We've kept those and then added in some best practices from that Climate Alliance presentation, some other desktop literature that we've done around other state plans. But with that, I'll present those to you guys, and you can modify and add to strategies and begin to brainstorm a little more broadly what those strategies should be and how our strategies can set Louisiana up for a future where we're meeting our net carbon neutrality goals. So after we talk about our sector-specific strategies, we'll also talk through some overarching strategies that might apply across sectors. So again, we don't want to work just in a silo of our sector, but understand that there are a lot of relationships with other sectors that need to be formed and actions that can be identified across groups. So as we move into our discussion, I just wanted to lay a few ground rules, again, to reiterate that we're going to focus on brainstorming, that we don't need to build consensus around every idea. We can just kind of get it all out there today and consider what success looks like in Louisiana. So again, with these broader strategies, how do they set us on a path to meet our targets? So we want to capture some concepts and ideas and can work on the wording and refining these a little bit later. And then I would just say that we do want to hear from everyone. You all have very different expertise and have brought you all together to this committee so that we can hear from each of you and the expertise you bring. So I'll lay out this starting menu of overarching strategies that we've developed. You guys have a lot of different ones. So you're covering agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste. So there are a lot of different strategies that this group might need to cover. So for example, under agriculture, we've been thinking through soil health and conservation practices. It's something that you guys have talked a lot about. Conservation tillage practices, fertilizer efficiency, water management, support and education for farmers, and then integrated approaches to farming that promote adaptation and sequestration. If we look under forestry, we can then look to reforestation and afforestation. There are a lot of different actions that would fall under that broad strategy, similarly with forest management practices. And then if we look to conservation, we can minimize loss of farmland and grazing land, minimize loss of forest, and then enhance our natural carbon sinks. And turning to waste, with our waste energy and then waste reduction measures, I know Yolanda has mentioned there's a lot of different actions that can be built within those as well. So that's just our starting menu. And then I'll show our cross-cutting strategies as well. Something you all mentioned last time under that I think relates to our manufacturing industry, possibly more economy-wide as well, is on emerging markets. So carbon tax and carbon markets that definitely have implications in this sector, reducing upstream emissions. Then with power, thinking through biofuels and methane recapture, incentivizing local generation of electricity, solar farms. And then with transportation, we've also talked about agriculture equipment would overlap with transportation and then consumption of locally produced commodities for agriculture and forestry. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you all. So Colleen is going to share her screen and it's just going to take notes so we can all visualize these different strategies as we start to think through them as a group. Okay.
Lindsay, Ron Harold, I have a question. On the cross-cutting strategies with other sectors, I see under transportation. Just exactly what is the thought behind promote consumption of locally produced agriculture and forestry commodities?
Well, I thought, and you guys can obviously amend this if you see fit, but I thought that could fit under transportation. So we're reducing emissions that people are, and not necessarily people, but maybe that producers are having to drive farther to bring agricultural goods across states or across the nation, that we're focusing in on and building networks that support our local farms, which then meets our transportation goals of reducing emissions, but also helps our farmers too. But if it works for everyone, let's start in the agriculture section of strategies, and maybe these are the overarching ideas. So with that, I'll open it to the floor. If you all have amendments or want to break down any of these strategies.
Hey, Ron, to get back to what you just mentioned, I think that would apply specifically to domestically used agricultural goods. Obviously, you know, trade wouldn't be interfered with there. Now,
That was my point, Joy. You know, when you talk about consumption of locally produced ag and forestry products, what we produce here, the majority of what we produce, especially on the grain crop side, goes into international trade.
Right, that is true. But we'll get back to that one. And I've got some thoughts popping up in my head. Coming back up to the front, Lindsay, I couldn't understand you real well, but you did say we're going to go ahead and get started on the ag strategies, correct?
Right, on these ag overarching strategies, and I apologize, I've had a lot of microphone issues with my computer. So can call in if it gets too bad, just let me know.
Okay.
But let's start with the agriculture strategies. Any thoughts you guys have on these listed out here? Want to break them down more, revise?
Well, for soil health and conservation practices, John and Mike, you guys specifically, and Devine and Doc, should that be broken out any further? Are there specific strategies that should be peeled off of that overarching strategy? Is it good as it is?
I think recognition of what's already implemented, you know, before we look to expand upon that, recognizing the trends over the last decades or few decades, you know, definitely we need to see where we are, because there has been drastically improved trends over the last few decades in these practices, adoption of these practices.
I agree. Shifts based on what I've seen coming out of NRCS and NASS and Ag Center surveys, for instance, cover crops on the way up across ag enterprises, and conservation tillage isn't a one-size-fits-all. There's been different types of conservation tillages. A couple of us were talking yesterday about how ridge till used to be one of the most common, and now might be one of the least. I don't hear as much about it. So yeah, there have been some trends toward the more positive potential gains in soil carbon. I agree.
Joey, this is Naveen. I think it is also valuable to have information on what other programs are supporting these conservation implementation in the state. I mean, we know there is the 319 project that also promotes certain conservation activities, and there's always value in knowing how much amount of funding is available for farmers in implementation of these practices, be it cost share or through other means, just to know what we are going after or what we wanted to advocate for.
Right. So another program under here would be, among what's being done when we're quantifying this, which programs are funding it? Farm Bill programs such as EQIP, Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, et cetera.
Naveen, I think those will be great to dive into under the actions. I'm curious, going back to Joey's point, does this category of soil health and conservation practices need to be broken down further? So we took out conservation tillage, as Joey mentioned, because there are a lot of different ways that we can create actions around conservation tillage. Are there other components of soil health and conservation that should be pulled out too? I know it's a very big strategy.
I know John can speak more to it, but I'll give my 2 cents on this. I mean, if we look at the trends, folks, there are 5 or 6 practices that jump to the top of the line, and then there are other practices that are certainly considered well below how the adoption levels of these top 5, 6 practices are. I think if we have those practices as our major focus, I think that should garner enough interest. So I don't know if I'm answering that question, but breaking down further, I mean, I don't think we'll be achieving anything additional in what we have planned so far, I guess. John, am I right in saying that certain practices do jump out in adoption?
Well, if you're talking about cropland, absolutely. You know, cover crop, crop rotation, the tillage practices, that, you know, those certainly jump out. The you know, moving to other land uses, you'd vary a little bit, but it all falls under soil health. You know.
I agree. It's hard to break it out too much. I guess Lindsay's point is, and the reason this is broken out, if I remember correctly, is because there were so many different conservation tillage practice options. And John, you shared some of those with us recently. And I don't know if this is the place to break those out. But yeah, conservation crop rotation, like you mentioned, no-till, cover crops, residue management, all those wonderful things. I don't know that there's anything more that we can do with the top 2, unless anybody has any ideas. Fertilizer efficiency, which means nutrient management to a lot of us, and water management. Can we break that out anymore?
I'm wondering where marginal lands fit into this agriculture category, opportunities for carbon sequestration and kind of sunsetting the production on marginal lands. I kind of know that falls into, we're getting into action territory when we're talking about payments to farmers for keeping land out of rotation. But I think we do need to acknowledge that marginal lands provide an opportunity for multiple benefits beyond, you know, the immediate goals of this group. And can also be seen as a conservation practice, but I don't see it represented out here.
The practice of cover crop would service to retire cropland from production. There's also, you know, all the forestry practices, reforestation, afforestation, for pulling marginal lands from crop production, you know, under our wetland reserve easement program. Most of the wetlands that were converted that are marginal for crop production are being put back into trees. There are some exceptions, but in Louisiana, most of them were bottomland hardwoods. And so it's more forestry practices, but there are some that are retired in a herbaceous community, and cover crop, or there's a new practice that we utilize, wildlife planting, code 420. Those would be the 2 primary to put them into some type of pollinator habitat, take it out of crop production. But the definition for conservation cover, I'm sorry, not cover crop. I'm mixing up the two. Conservation cover would be for retiring, whether it's temporary or permanent, retiring cropland.
I think that gets to our conservation category as well, kind of an overlap of the ag and conservation.
Yeah, I know as a result of the billion-ton study years ago, there was a lot of talk about using marginal lands to grow some perennial grasses that function as grow better and produce a lot more benefits on these marginal lands. And I'm not sure if that conversation is continuing, but I do know that biofuels was a big part of that Princeton study we were listening to a few weeks ago. So I just want to throw that out there.
Justin, I agree. And there are a lot of thoughts on that. Restoration and maintenance of native ecosystems, to me, fits in here, at least partially. And in Louisiana, a large portion of South Louisiana, that means grasslands, native grasslands. And I think we all know that those tall grass prairie natives, if managed consistent with the cycles that were prevalent in the evolution of those ecosystems, burning and grazing, the amount of below ground biomass while you're gaining all the other benefits to be gained from restoration of that ecotype are massive and can mean really big things in carbon and greenhouse gas sequestration. So yeah, it's there's a lot to be said there. A lot of people are thinking it. It's just a hard thing to make happen.
Justin, I think that's a potential cross-cutting strategy as well to work with the Power Committee or one of those groups that is also working on alternative fuel development.
Emerging markets are going to pop up a lot in our conversations. I mean, just within agriculture, forestry, and conservation, I was already wondering how well we're going to be able to divvy them up, and we're already blending one into the other. So looking forward to the rest of this conversation.
And I think it's entirely fine if we leave these as broader categories now. As we go into actions, we might come back and say that cover crops, or there's another component that needs to be a strategy instead of an action. So I think it's great to leave these for now. And Colleen, maybe let's move on to the forestry ones. So forestry.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you hear me all right? This is Robbie Toombs.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I just wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mike Lindsay. Can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure what the problem was, but looking at the fertilizer, et cetera, that fertilizer use efficiency and water use efficiency, that ties directly back into those soil health practices as well, because over time you reduce the need for fertilizer, so that goes to the efficiency and the water management as well, being able to store more water in the soil as opposed to runoff. So those things go hand in hand.
Thanks, Mike. And before we get off this page, I keep looking at support and education for farmers. I just keep feeling like that should be more specifically technical and financial support and education for farmers.
And to the end, the NRCS programs that help producers implement soil health management systems, conservation practices across the board. This year they have an enhanced EQIP program that's target is soil health statewide.
Wow.
That's a great flag, Joey, on the technical and financial support, and Michael as well. I think we can get into that on the action.
Robbie, do you have anything to add under forestry?
Yes, I have 2 or 3 thoughts. Dovetail with the ag discussion where it says reforestation and afforestation. Right now, Joey, your department knows probably more about this than I do, but I think we have about 13 million acres of timberland in the state, and across the state, we're pretty much growing more than we're harvesting. But you know, when you talk about incentives and education and technical expertise, you have LDAF providing, you know, outreach. You have NRCS providing outreach, USDA, through the Forest Service, and others. So, and then I just Googled while you were talking, number of programs in Louisiana, and it looks like there's maybe, I lost count on the number of state programs. Federal programs. There's a couple of state programs like Louisiana Forestry Productivity Program. There's a property tax program, and then you have some private incentives like longleaf restoration program. So if we do anything along those lines, it would probably be to enhance what's already there rather than reinvent the wheel. Forest management practices to me is outreach and education. And I know LSU Ag, and I'm 3 years into working in Mississippi, so in Louisiana, my experience is Mississippi primarily, but I've learned a lot, and I've been impressed with all the various outreach and educational opportunities to private landowners. And frankly, one of the reasons that we have a positive growth to drain, we're growing more than we're harvesting, is because there has been such a major focus on, getting in non-industrial private landowners to manage their forest. And really so that switches over, and Lindsay, you're probably going to tell me that would be a cross-sector reference, but one of the key to good forest management is people, just like farming, being able to make money to stay in business. So good forest management takes, opportunities to sell your timber. And the two opportunities that Louisiana currently, to me, is limited on, we're getting new sawmills. There will probably never be a new paper mill built. I shouldn't say never, but the likelihood of that happening to use the smaller wood. We have Drax at both Beekman and Urania do pellets, but without going into it too much, I fully support solar and wind generation, but I think there's a place for generating electricity through use of biofuels. You gentlemen addressed that earlier in the ag sector as well. That's what Drax does. They make pellets and they ship them all the way to England so they can make energy out of it. I'm not an expert on the net effect of carbon on that, but I know it's more carbon effective, if the word is correct, than burning coal. And we also know the reliability issues around solar and wind. You would be able to burn the pellets 24/7 as long as you're able to have them. So the other ones that I suggest would be encouraging through both maybe economic development incentives and building codes, and maybe even the state incentivizing new state buildings to be built out of mass timber construction. There's several different types of mass timber. One is CLT, cross-laminated timber, and I'm blanking on the professor's name at LSU that has been working on that. But cross-laminated timber is basically 2x6s laid together to make a panel, and they lay multiple layers and they cross the grain with the layers, just like you do in plywood, to increase the strength. You get the benefit of utilizing the timber plus the carbon storage attributes of it. And it can be a very efficient way to build. And it's actually, there's been a lot of tests on fire retardants. And I think that across the nation, the building codes are starting to address the ability to do that. So that's really the two main ones that I came up with, besides trying to always enhance and improve what we do for particularly private landowners. My company, this is what we do, is who we are. So we're going to do good forest management, and we're going to follow good forest stewardship practices. But you really want to encourage the thousands upon thousands of private landowners in Louisiana to do the same.
Robbie, I have a question. This is as much my information. I'm not that familiar as forestry. Just how significant, you mentioned pelletizing, is that to the Louisiana forestry industry?
I'm not an expert on the carbon aspect of it, but let me think for a second about my answer. The utilizing the smaller wood, the pulp wood, if you will, residuals out of sawmills that are coming in, it is, it's very significant to be able to manage a good, particularly pine plantation forest, to encourage tree development. It's all about spacing and sunlight to the crown, in conjunction with some other treatments like competition control and maybe nutrient supplement. But the ability to thin your timber is important, and the ability to grow a good cash final crop. And the really nice thing about this, it's all very, I don't know if the word's holistic or very intertwined, because if you can utilize your pulpwood, your smaller wood, you thin, you keep up the health of the forest, and then at final harvest, you get bigger trees that are worth a higher value. And if we can start utilizing those and CLT, then we have a new product coming in. And somebody messaged me, it was Dr. Blosky at LSU, that uses our added value products at final harvest. So it's very much all about the cycle of the forest. I hope I answered your question. If not, I'll try to do better.
Yeah, you did. And just to follow up on that, I think I understood you right. So you would be growing trees specifically for the pelletization part of it?
Well, that actually becomes a byproduct of what we do. Our target for us, each individual landowner has a reason that they own the timberland and the reason they grow the timber. If you own timberland, your main function on it may be as much recreation as it is actually growing timber. But for us, the key is generating cash flow in an environmentally sustainable way for our clients. And so thinning that timber, that intermediate practice of bringing out the smaller wood is critical in growing the larger timber that goes into the sawmills. If you think about, and I hope I'm not talking down to anybody, but if you think about basic biology and you remember photosynthesis, then sunlight to the crown, it generates photosynthesis, and the leaves are bringing that carbon out of the air and breathing out oxygen, and then they're creating the food source that moves up and down the tree, and it shows up in diameter development. If you don't thin your trees, then they're not, and particularly if you have a fairly large number of trees on a stand and you don't maintain the proper crown ratio to have enough crown to have that factory, if you will, of leaves that is producing the food sources that go down to the bole of the tree and do the growth and the diameter, then you'll always have those smaller trees that don't move into the larger product categories and thereby the larger values.
Yeah. So
Robbie,
I'm sorry. I just thought I would jump in here. This is Carla Shanae. I'm with Drax Biomass.
I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. I need
I'm
some
here.
help.
No problem. And please don't, if there's any other information I can go gather that I can't share now, I'm happy to do that as well. But Robbie has it right in terms of how we source. So nothing is purposely grown for biomass. We do take the low value trees as a byproduct of active forest management with an end goal of producing solid wood products. So it's interesting that, I had jotted down my potential action items, and Robbie just nailed all of them. I had separated them into 3 parts, but they work into. So and I would say that with the law, I mean, we can see this actively happening in Louisiana with the loss of GP Port Hudson as a market for that low grade material, that landowners are starting to struggle. They're starting to have to make choices of what they're going to do with their land. And no offense to the agriculture side, but on the forestry end, we like to see it in trees. We would prefer to see it storing carbon, growing, material to go into the market and to be sequestered in that solid wood product and to continue to sequester carbon through growth. So we have some concerns over that, and there might be a really nice fit here for Louisiana to consider using biomass in place of some coal usage, which we have obvious carbon savings there, and it's going to be providing a market. It's going to be sequestering, to encourage that good forest management that Robbie's been saying. So I worry that we're losing because we are just a tiny piece. We have a small sourcing area. We can't take in all that material. We would love to. I would love to be able to help, but we can't. And I think there's a place to grow that biomass market in Louisiana. And it doesn't necessarily have to be through pellets. Pelletizing works fantastically for loading onto container ships, but wood chips can work just as well. There's an advantage to the pellets as far as it fits very nicely with existing coal technology. But again, I'm happy to answer questions if I can't do it on the spot. I can gather that information for you to help support.
No, Kayla, and Robbie, I think this is an excellent market incentive strategy. What you're talking about with this pelletization process, and not only that, but it provides a significant, in my way of thinking, opportunity to sequester carbon. So you're doing 2 things at the same time. You're creating an incentive out there, but you're also providing a means of capturing as much CO2 as you're talking about 13 million acres. I mean, that's just kind of mind-boggling to me that we have that kind of forest land in Louisiana. That's a significant carbon sink, if you will.
Yes, it is, and thank you for that. And just to add on to Kyla, not only did GP shut down Port Hudson, but they also shut down Crossett, Arkansas, which is that's where I grew up. It's 9 miles north of the Louisiana line, north of Bastrop. And in the past, you've had IP close Bastrop, IP close Pineville, IP close Natchez, Mississippi, which pulled a lot of timber out of Louisiana. So net, the utilization of the smaller standing trees, and Kyla knows this well because Uranium Mill is co-located with the LaSalle Lumber Company, and LaSalle trucks those residual chips over to the Drax plant, and so it's wonderful to get that new sawmill. But every new sawmill brings with it a lot less than they used to because they're so very efficient nowadays, but they still create residual chips. And sometimes the biggest holdback on locating a new sawmill is finding a place to get rid of your chips. So, it's just to grease the entire wheel, if you will. It's a very important part.
Can I ask just a clarifying question? Because I think this has been a good discussion that's hit on a lot of really good key considerations for Louisiana in the forestry sector, and also already starting to get into actions, which we can, I think, revisit in the next conversation. But I also think I heard something that was an additional sort of strategy bucket. So I think just to kind of focus us back on the exercise on strategies, I think we want to make sure we've got the right sort of buckets under each of these sectors and that we're not missing something. So I heard something good, I think, first from Robbie around not just the management practices, but also encouraging the use of different timber and biomass products. But maybe Kyla and Robbie, you can help me wordsmith this a little bit more, this third bullet, just to make sure we've captured that. And then maybe we can move on to conservation.
I'm not sure I understand the question. The other thing that I mentioned was mass timber buildings and doing some form of incentive and building codes, economic development to bring in a manufacturer of mass timber products. Structural Lamb is locating in Conway, Arkansas, and I've seen their CEO speak, and they're looking at other areas, and they build, they lay up CLT, cross-laminated timbers. And I know I shared with some folks that the new Walmart world headquarters at Bentonville, Arkansas, will be constructed entirely out of CLT, and they bought into Structural Lamb to help build that. And that's how that mill got located at Conway. Encouraging that, incentivizing that. Yeah. Is that what you're asking?
I think we can get into the tactics in the next discussion. I just want to make sure we've got that bucket captured. So we're not missing the bucket
maybe it's
on encouraging.
Yeah. Encouraging utilization of new forestry products like mass timber construction.
Robbie, on the, you were talking about, I guess, byproducts of forestry operations and pellets, et cetera. Has there been much discussion along the lines of creating biochar and then biochar going back into the land to help build up those forest soils? And the reason I ask that is in the sugarcane growing areas, there's some work going on developing biochar from sugarcane bagasse from the byproduct of the sugar milling process. That biochar can be returned to those ag lands to help. Some studies showed significant increases in fertility, production, et cetera, but also kind of a byproduct of the biochar process or syngases, which would be an alternative energy source. Is there anything on the biochar front, where it can, obviously sugarcane bagasse isn't going to work for North Louisiana soils, but the obvious feedstock would be, forest materials.
Right. And
Mike,
go ahead. Who was that?
Mike, can I derail for a second? Mike, we're going to get to that when we address, as we mentioned, those alternative fuels a little farther down. But right now we want to focus on these overarching buckets, and maybe we can make notes of those different actions to bring back up in the next conversation. So that's all right. I'm going to read the conservation.
Okay.
That's okay. So how do these buckets, these overarching buckets, and we just have a few minutes to spend on the conservation and waste, so I want to make sure we have everything covered here. So we have these three different categories that we've put forth minimizing loss of farmland and grazing land, minimizing loss of forest, something that was mentioned above as well, and then enhancing natural carbon sinks. How do you all think this covers the conservation aspect of this group? Any additional?
I think it does a pretty good job.
I think so too, Lindsay. It really captures some of the things that we were putting in elsewhere. Natural carbon sinks, what I said earlier about native ecotype restoration and maintenance would go there as well. I think this is pretty adequate, personally.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Lindsay, I'd maybe only add, this is Greg Grandy, the minimized loss of wetlands as a kind of separate line item.
That's a great idea.
I can't see all the bullets, but in terms of ecosystem restoration, I would agree with that. And that is also a place that harvesting, active management and harvesting that low-grade material can be helpful. So the longleaf pine ecosystem would be an example, just that open pine system that supports a number of imperiled species in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So there's added benefits there to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask where this might go? I'm wondering about kind of a workforce development project to get people engaged in mitigation activities like better management of forests, but then have the whole chain of command like site work, nurseries, et cetera, while you're getting these benefits. And I don't know exactly where something like that might go, but that would be with support of USDA extension, et cetera, programs, have rural workforce development associated with mitigation.
I know
Karen,
workforce
I think that's a great idea.
I was just going to say, I think workforce development is a theme across a lot of the sectors. And I think will be a cross-cutting theme in the strategy, but also where we recognize there's going to be specific actions that are sector specific. So I think that's a really good kind of flag that we can probably come back to as we dive on deeper on actions too.
And
I think that would
I have.
Yes, Robbie.
Oh, I was just going to say, I know you don't want to get into it deep right now, but when the time's appropriate, I think I have some answers or some of the thoughts to Karen's question.
Mm-hmm. That'd be great. We can dive into that in the next conversation. So our last category we're looking at is.
I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, we kind of it kind of captures it a little bit, minimize loss of wetlands, but I think a focus on riparian corridors, restoration in those areas can check a lot of boxes for us. And then in terms of, there's a lot of controlled waterways in Louisiana with, flow releases, dams, chaffali, you name it, and assessing flow regimes for, the connection of water with, riparian areas and reconnecting wetlands and reconnecting some floodplain areas can maximize a lot of nutrient cycling and carbon capture, which goes hand in hand with the conservation and minimizing loss of forests, grazing lands, and things like that.
Justin, do you think assessing flow regimes is something that would fall under sort of riparian corridors, or do you think it rises to the level of its own strategy?
It might be its own strategy. From the riparian corridors, I mean, like our treatment of them, how well protected they are. I know that, scenic rivers have like 100-foot buffer, and there's not much of a buffer for other areas. And assessing flow regimes is, I mean, that's a big thing, but I think from the climate task force point of view, are there opportunities to maintain the recreation, to maintain the flood mitigation goals, to maintain water, supply, if whatever the purpose of those reservoirs are, but to operate them in a way that is aligned with our climate change, our long-term climate change goals here.
That's a great catch. Both of those are great flags on strategies.
In an effort to build upon those that were added and going back to farmland, grazing land, and even forest lands, I would like to see prime ahead of that, where we're talking about minimizing the loss of prime farmland, prime grazing land, and where we're not converting marginal lands into trying to produce on that and costing more and, to try and develop products, ag products out of that. But identifying the prime areas, the ones that function more for maintaining flood control, recreation, be it whatever it is, riparian forests stay in those ecological functions.
That's a great addition. Any other thoughts on conservation before we move to waste?
Yeah, this is Fran Harvey, just under natural carbon sinks, maybe the distinction between biogenics and anthropogenics. I think a distinction needs to be made, because I'm hearing a lot about, fields that have been planted and or taken out of agriculture, but biogenics I don't think has been touched on.
Mm-hmm. And we can begin to break that down as we get into those actions.
Yeah. Thank you.
So moving on to waste, we have two under here. Yolanda, we might lean heavily on you in this category. I know last time you had talked about, I think that should be waste to energy, possibly, and waste reduction as well. How do you, Yolanda, and our other members, how do you think this covers our waste sector?
I'm trying to
Was there something leading back to the previous discussion? I'm sorry, now my dog's acting up. To look at using waste as fertilizer, the biochar example.
Yeah, we might need to clarify. Waste reduction in some worlds means you're reducing it by burning or composting or some other thing. I think waste reduction here was intended just to mean to produce less of it or more beneficial use of the manufactured good with less waste generated, something like that. Could go either way.
I agree with that, but the waste to energy, the biochar production, there's syngas produced, which is an energy source to produce the biochar, which is in turn used as a sequestered source of carbon to be returned to soil, which also somewhat acts as a fertilizer. It's a kind of multi-beneficial use stream.
Right. And it can mean a lot of things, especially when it comes to tree debris and wood waste. And Yolanda and I know a lot about that. And it just may come back to actions, and I don't want to muddle what we're into now by bringing that out here. Might be best for later.
Mm-hmm.
I think we would be well served to kind of clear up what we mean by waste here, though. Right? We talked a lot earlier about what potentially at one point in time were waste products in forestry and timber practices that are now going to pellets and stuff. So I know it would benefit me if we had clear definitions of what we meant by waste in this section here.
No, Justin, I think that's a very good point. We do need to clarify when we're talking about agricultural waste, just exactly what is that? Good point.
Ag residues and all that stuff.
Well, beyond residues, let's just say ag processing wastes and residues. We deal a lot with rice mills, rice hulls. I mean, there's a demand for rice hulls in the poultry industry and other places. There's a lot of it that doesn't go anywhere. There's a lot of silica there, a lot of cellulose, a lot of potential. So agricultural processing residues, again, that can mean cotton gin trash, bagasse, sweet potato peels, you name it. It's a lot of stuff. Or you could say ag and forestry processing residues. I think they may kind of go together. You may want to keep those separate. Then beyond that, you would have food waste, the putrescible type things, which are a whole different waste altogether, but could potentially have value in the right setting with the right bulking agents, which comes back from forestry and ag processing. That's where you get those cellulosic bulking agents. So, yeah, ag and forestry processing, wastes and residues, seafood processing residues is a separate one altogether, and we deal with a lot of that, don't we, Yolanda? And it's not production forestry waste, but tree debris, wood waste. Tree debris is immense in this state, especially since Hurricane Laura. And
Yeah.
if you don't know, just ask Yolanda. It's big. And that's really not forestry waste. It's coming from urban settings and whatnot, from arborists. It's massive. And there's a lot of, we'll just say, bioenergy potential there. So however we'd want to break all those things out, yes, Justin, there's some categories there. That's for sure.
But generally speaking, we're talking about solid waste in this category.
Yeah.
Maybe not, and I may be off basis, Robbie, of course. From a solid wood mill waste, you have the chips I talked about previously. From the paper mills that exist, their waste is more of it's called, for lack of a better term, mill sludge. But it's the byproducts that come out of when they clean the water back that they use in the paper making process. They're laying up fibers, and so not all those fibers get laid up. There's just different fibers and materials there, and I won't get in. I've seen some uses of that. A lot of times that's reburned actually to create energy. Paper mills make a lot of energy because they use a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm. So as you all mentioned, I think waste here can cover both recycling and composting and reuse and reduced generation of waste, as well as what you have all been talking about with agriculture and forestry and food waste reduction as well.
Yeah,
So can see
just
that
an
over.
example, going back to the rice hulls that Joey mentioned. Rice hulls are a waste product, if you will, from the rice milling. These hulls are put into broiler houses. They become part of the poultry litter. And then this litter has a fertilization value, but it also has a value for energy production. So you're taking a waste product, and you have the potential with proper incentives, and I guess by incentives, I mean the entities that are empowered to make it happen, to work with this particular industry, rice and poultry, and you have a valuable product that can be utilized for methane gas production.
Mm-hmm. So how do these three categories in broad buckets function to address all of these issues of waste? So we'll jump into, Ron, more what you mentioned, and Joey and Robbie as well, what you both mentioned on waste when we talk through actions, but just wanted to make sure these three are good categories for us.
I think those are broad enough categories: the waste to energy, the reuse, and then the reduction. I think those are broad enough categories that would cover the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So maybe with that, we can end our discussion on strategies. I'll tee up a little bit on our working session with actions. And then we'll jump back onto that page and start fleshing through actions, which I know everyone is excited to do. Let me find my right screen. So thank you everyone for those wonderful ideas. That really helped to enhance the strategies that we had started developing. And I just wanted to hit on these general or non-sector themes and strategies that we won't go directly into, but wanted to flag so you would all be aware that there are many general or non-sector specific themes that are also very relevant to our conversation. And Karen had brought this up a little bit before, but thinking through these economy-wide mechanisms, climate equity, economic transition, engagement, and education. I know it's something big that we've talked about in this sector in past meetings. Also on research and development, we know there will be a lot of questions. As we start to answer research questions, I'm sure there will be plenty more that begin to show. So being able to keep track of those questions and potential future areas of study as well will be good. And then finance as well. How do we finance and implement these measures too? So now we're going to dive into the strategies we just discussed and start developing actions within them. So just to lay out some desired outcomes for this working session, we're going to brainstorm a thorough list of potential actions, starting with the strategies we just developed. And we'll go one by one and start to identify actions that support each of our strategies. And then once we have a thorough, comprehensive list of these actions together, then we'll go back through and assign committee members to lead or to support in development of the action proposals for different specific ones that we've identified. And so we've broken that up so that you all can propose different actions and not feel like you have to then go develop that one. So we'll lay it all out there and then go back through and assign roles to who will lead each. And as we go throughout, also please identify any additional research tasks that are needed to support action development. Possibly there are other committee members that have done research or know of the research that you might need to complete the action proposal. So that's just another thing to flag. And just a reminder, an action is based around a specific policy, program, or project. So now we're diving into the details of those actions and how we can directly implement them. So just some ground rules. Again, we're going to focus on brainstorming. There are no bad ideas and no need for group consensus at this point. There might be some different approaches to similar actions, and that's quite all right for people to develop common or similar approaches to see where they might go. And also keeping in mind that we're trying to work towards meeting our goals of emission reduction in Louisiana. And this group has a unique opportunity to maximize not only our emission reduction, but also our carbon storage potential. And we would like everyone to speak during this session. So everyone will have homework, and we're going to do the best that we can to help you all share the load fairly across the committee. And our chairs are going to be helpful in assigning and tasking out homework. So with that, I'm going to pass it right back over to Colleen, who's going to bring us back to that list. So now to the fun part that everyone's been waiting for. Let's maybe start with agriculture, start with this big category of soil health and conservation practices. Start thinking through some different actions under here of how we can maximize those emission reductions. I know we've talked about traditional and innovative BMPs, but you all know that far better than I do.
Lindsay, one thing I would like to put in here is it's one thing to talk conservation in BMPs, but getting them to the ground consistently, I think, is a very beneficial thing, and we do it well in Louisiana. I would just put under actions conservation delivery network or Louisiana conservation delivery. Does that make sense?
So Joey, what would an action look like? Would that be a policy, or is that a project that maybe an agency would do, or farmers more?
It would be a program, a delivery program.
Okay, great. And that would be done at the state level in concert with farmers?
In concert with technical and financial assistance partners and farmers at the local level, delivered at the local level.
Implementing the current delivery system through state, federal, Soil and Water Conservation District, USDA. I mean, we have a field office in 44 of the 64 parishes already, where state and federal employees are together for the sole purpose of providing technical and financial assistance to all ag producers, be it cropland, livestock, non-industrial private forest land.
Yeah, maybe we can follow what USDA has done, where for certain states or regions or watersheds they have expanded EQIP. Maybe the state can look into a program where farmers can enroll themselves into a climate mitigation program and have them have these practices long term, maybe not 5 years but 10 years. That way whoever wants to participate in this transaction, be it a point versus non-point, they have verifiable data, which is certainly long-term.
Pretty good there, Naveen. Some of us here really like the sound of a state conservation program.
Yeah, I think I always thought we had those programs, Joey. They just got into the same bag of several other programs. I mean, as you said, yeah, we do a lot of conservation in the state. It's just showing what we do, I guess.
And then what I think maybe ought to plug in right here, Ron, whatever the title of the piece was that you and Ben put together was similar to this, wasn't it?
Yeah, essentially to curtail and capture agricultural greenhouse gas emissions through voluntary market incentive based strategies. Market incentive based strategies. There you go. And you know, we have the structure. I mean, it's there with the scientists and economists we have in the Ag Center, NRCS and Soil and Water Districts. You know, I mean, it's there. It's just kind of bringing that to everyone's attention that, you know, we're ready to go. And we are already doing this. It just needs to be recognized.
That's great to hear, Ron. Now, would that be based around implementing more innovative BMPs, or what would the incentive-based strategies be furthering?
I think that, go ahead, Ron. I'll speak after you guys.
Through various NRCS programs, this helps producers implement these practices. And through FSA, there are certain financial incentives or assistance that can help farmers do this. But I think that, you know, we're focusing on climate issues. You know, these programs need to be expanded, and climate needs to become more prominent in what these programs are out there trying to do. Most of everything that we've done in the past, Lindsay, was based on the best management practices that we're talking about, was based on water quality. And that's what kind of prompted that whole process of the, and I don't know how familiar you are with the Louisiana Master Farmer Program, and Ernest can talk about that better than I can. But that's kind of what I see is that, you know, climate issues have come to the forefront. And the programs that we have, the best management programs, the conservation programs that farmers are used to, now climate needs to be included in that conversation. A lot of the things that are done, you know, well, how much carbon is this actually sequestering? What is this doing to reduce nitrous oxide production, methane production? Things of this.
Ron, along those lines, as you mentioned, the USDA contributions to those offsets for farmers, that financial assistance, it's something of a finite dollar amount based on a national budget. We can always lobby for more. Again, Louisiana is pushing more towards the soil health and conservation practices in that direction, which feeds directly into this. But there are limited dollars there. Mentioned a minute ago was a state conservation effort there. So I think to really get more bang for the buck, since this is a Louisiana climate initiative, finding a similar pool of money from the state that the conservation districts can bring to the table, as well as with the NRCS funds. Does that make sense?
That's exactly my point. There's a lot of money out there that's going to be directed toward everything that we're trying to do, not just here in Louisiana, but in the other states. And we need to go out there and present a program, present a strategy to justify acquiring as much of this funding as we possibly can to implement these things that are going to have a positive impact on the goal of this whole endeavor to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Again, I can't overemphasize the push the new state conservationist has in the direction of pushing soil health practices across the state in Louisiana for producers, providing assistance. There's in addition to the normal EQIP and funding that we do, there is an additional EQIP CIC project that is statewide targeting soil health practices. So there'll be additional dollars there, but additional dollars from the state that would go to the conservation districts would go a long way towards adding a push on that effort.
I think we're now getting even a little bit into like the details of the how on actions. But I think I heard maybe 3 different action ideas under soil health, and I'm not sure if they're actually 3 different ones, or if these could potentially combine. But again, bringing us back to an action is a specific project, program, or policy that is sort of centered around. So one, I think, Joey, you brought this up, the Louisiana Conservation Delivery Program that would bring technical and financial assistant partners together with state agencies. I heard, I think, from Naveen, State Climate Mitigation Program for Farmers, maybe those are the same thing. And then the voluntary market incentive-based strategies and tools, which could be a component of that, or I could see reason to kind of develop that out as its own action more specifically as well.
Leaving it out as its own action, Colleen, might be good right now, because I mentioned up front in what John Pete described fairly succinctly has been in place for decades, since the 30s. It's been around for a long time, but these other things, it's not what people are thinking, and not why that program, to the extent that it is being funded at all. And the NRCS plus state funds, as it stands right now, the state does allocate limited funds to statewide conservation districts. The ratio of federal to state funds going into conservation through that program is probably in the neighborhood of 100 to 1. So the state is way down, way low. Adding some of these other things may be important to kind of help and bring that up. In other words, these programs, as mentioned here, in their own rights don't exist. Some of that may be accomplished through the standard conservation district program, but it's not how it's being marketed, and it's not part of the funding mechanism whereby those funds are leveraged into the districts from the legislature. And if I may add one thing, and maybe it doesn't go here, maybe it needs to be someplace else, but innovation, Lindsay keeps mentioning it, and I like it. I keep trying to get it on the ground, or I mention it in the grants that I write. And NRCS has typically annually funded conservation innovation grants that I think are very critical. And part of the, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike and John, but the NRCS conservation practices that so much of the work that's been done is built on, they're fairly standardized and have to be approved as standards to fit in into the field office technical guide. Conservation innovations are things that may lie outside of that, but if it comes out looking like something that could be replicated and further and standardized down the road and delivered through the conservation delivery network, if you will, that conservation innovation grant opportunity is one of the key proving grounds for these little innovations. Maybe some of them cannot be replicated, but good conservation could possibly hit the ground regardless, and maybe influencing, I guess, a broadening of that opportunity in the types of innovations that it may consider. John, did that make sense?
You're right on, Joey. That's exactly how it works. You know, what is being called BMPs here, you know, in NRCS, we utilize conservation practice standards. Those standards, which are the same in every state. They're national standards. They accepted general use recipes, I guess, to address resource concerns. A state has the ability to include specifications for local geographic differences. Then on a national level and a state level, we fund conservation innovation grants. We're recently talking about biochar. We currently have a state conservation innovation grant for biochar treatments in Louisiana because we have no land grant recommendations, which NRCS utilizes land grant recommendations for the implementation of biochar rates. So currently, until April 30th, there is a grant for up to $150,000 to develop those rates in Louisiana on grants.gov. So yes, we have a conservation innovation grants program on the national scale and on the state scale. And when we can find those reproducible innovations, they make their way into the conservation standards in our field office technical guide.
And
thanks, John.
Joey, again, you know, just to kind of follow up on this, you know, these land management practices that we have been and are continuing to implement, you know, they've done essentially three things the way I see it. They've helped improve our soils. They've helped with water quality and quantity. They've also helped to support biodiversity. And my thought is that, you know, we need to examine these practices as to their role in addressing greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I think those are great different action ideas under this category. But since we only have about 30 minutes to get through all of our different strategies, if we can focus on these policies, programs, and projects under action, maybe you guys can divide into teams of 2 or 3 to dive into what that might look like in more detail, just so we can stay on time and keep on track. So I'm going to move us along to the conservation tillage practices. Joey, I'm not sure if you had some action ideas under this one.
Well, I think it's obvious that this would pertain exclusively to cropland. And John, I'm thinking, well, no-till and residue management, they've come up elsewhere, but they're here. No-till residue management, dry seeding, especially in the Mermentau Basin, to go even at 90% dry seeding there would be huge. No-till residue management of any sort, dry seeding. And it's not a conservation tillage practice, and but I keep thinking other things that enable these practices, no-till and residue management and dry seeding. John and Mike, it's irrigation land leveling. It's a when you get done with that, the field is highly disturbed. It looks like anything but conservation. But if you look at the conservation that you get down the road in subsequent cropping years, it can create opportunities that otherwise would not have existed. And I don't know where that ought to go, but I just don't feel like walking away from it. And I'd like to know what y'all think about that.
I'm kind of struggling with conservation tillage being broken out, you know, from the previous bullet, because that's one of the soil health practices. You know, I'm not sure that one specific bullet needs to be broken out on its own.
I agree, John. I agree.
Yeah, you know, cover crops, things to try to enhance soil carbon sequestration, mitigation of greenhouse gases. If you're not doing some sort of conservation tillage along with that, you're really minimizing your total effectiveness. The conservation tillage and the other practices, they go together as a management system to work best. Any single one's better than nothing, but the synergistic effect of everything in a quote unquote management system really is where the bang for the buck is. They feed each other. And again, it's a synergistic deal that's the sum is greater than the individual pieces.
Absolutely. All part of that soil health system. And then to further mess things up, and I hate saying this, but the conservation delivery system in place that we talked about building upon seems to go more under the third bullet now, technical and financial. So it's not strictly under, you know, soil health. It applies to delivering all conservation practices or BMPs.
I think that's a good flag. One, I guess, follow up for all of you on conservation tillage practices. How would that be implemented? Is that its own sort of program, or is it a tactic or a practice that would fall under some of these programs that we've already highlighted?
That is one of the practices in the soil health system.
That would be implemented by farmers through some of these specific
Yes.
programs and incentives.
Yeah, to me, the tillage falls directly under the soil health and conservation practices. That soil health and conservation practices is a multi-leg stool. A two-legged stool is fairly ineffective, so it's one of the key legs in that stool. I'd put it squarely under that soil health and conservation practices.
To that end, Mike, if we're going to put it there, should we mention the other key or core soil health practices along with it?
Certainly, I feel that cover crops, you know, keeping a living root in the ground year round is basic to that. You know, it's this. Maybe we could recap what a soil health management system is.
That would probably be good, because I think too abbreviated, it may mean different things to different people.
Yeah, because soil health is not separate from conservation practices or tillage practices. It's
what you get.
Really looking at it, it's something of a holistic approach.
Right.
And again,
So Mike,
any single practice is better than none, but you get more benefit when you tie those practices together. But planting cover crops and then coming back and tilling and using conventional tillage, you erase 90% of the benefit. You know, so
Mike,
and then doing no-till without having the cover crops in the off season to keep pumping carbon in the ground and holding those nutrients up in the upper profile to be used later on, you lose benefit there. It's when you tie those practices together in a suite of practices known as a soil health management system is where you get the most bang for the buck.
Gotcha.
Environmentally, financially, and everything.
Under this strategy, that could turn into a great program, since you're saying it's all interconnected. And there might be a few different tactics of implementing that. So maybe when we come back around and assign out homework, maybe you can work with one or two other members on developing what that looks like and clarifying on what soil health management is.
Right, and several of us are already working together on the side on these things.
Great. So moving on to fertilizer efficiency and water management, what actions do you all see relevant under this strategy?
I'll tell you what, given what I just said about, I don't know, maybe that shouldn't go in here. It's just always in the back of my mind, and I think it's an under-recognized practice. What I just said about irrigation land leveling, I'll leave it out. Maybe I'll just put that into whatever I work on the side in one of my action proposals. But fertilizer efficiency and water management, to me, and Karen, tell me what you think, when we're dealing so much in other realms with nutrient management and hypoxia reduction, bam, that's a big chunk of that. And so yeah, the actions there, I think should speak pretty loudly as well from a greenhouse gas offset perspective. And maybe additionally there, when you consider emissions arising from agriculture, one of the types of ag that I grew up around the most, is probably beat over the head the most regarding methane emissions, is rice production. And I just, I don't know. I don't know what could be done there or how things might be made differently other than row rice. And I don't want to regard that as the only option. But fertilizer efficiency and water management, unless somebody has anything else to put there, I see Colleen's putting down rice production. I would just say, yeah, rice production, BMPs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what else to say right now, but I would be glad to try to work with someone on that. Naveen, I guess Dustin Harrell would be the guy in the Ag Center, right?
Right, Joey. But I think it goes back to what John mentioned earlier. We cannot separate these practices and try to identify actions. They all fall into what can be done by the farmers with respect to, let's say, fertilizer efficiency, water management, and all they're tied up to soil health. So I think, man, trying to separate them into categories and trying to write under actions is not going to, bring any additional.
Right.
I think, you see what I'm saying? They all fall into these management actions, and they're all tied to soil health. You talk about irrigation, land leveling, or fertilizer efficiency, so on and so forth. You water better, you use a surge valve or a flow meter, manage your irrigation well, and it's tied to, again, soil loss, and it's tied to soil health, so on and so forth. So,
and I think that will be true often, that you'll have an action that actually ties to multiple strategies. And I think that'll help us with that hierarchy and that bucketing if we've got that right. So I think that's fine if for this strategy that actually a lot of the actions that we've already flagged would help achieve this. And then it's just a question of, are we missing anything? Are we missing any sort of specific actions that are going to help us get to this strategy? And, I have here rice production BMPs, is that research and development around that? Is there additional kind of research and development that might be needed? Perhaps one thing to think about there in terms of a specific action. But maybe we can keep moving down, Lindsay.
Yeah, let's keep moving on to the technical and financial support. I think this one can also, as you mentioned, Naveen, tie back into some of the soil health practices that were mentioned is alongside the integrated approaches to farming that promote adaptation and sequestration. But what are the specific actions that might help us achieve this strategy of technical and financial support? I know this has been a big focus of this group, so it'd be great to get your action ideas.
So Lindsay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen.
So, thank you, Naveen. One of my colleagues had suggested, Jim Bergen, that many of you know and have worked with, establishing a Louisiana-based carbon exchange market pilot, excuse me, that would be voluntary and provide tax benefits for companies that come into the market to purchase credits from Louisiana landowners. So that concept, and I'm not exactly sure where that would fit into that category, but the whole idea, I think it's part of the delivery program as well. But could there be a market pilot?
Karen, I think, that right there is very important. And I know in some states this is being done, where the agricultural community is working with industries, and industries are paying X amount of dollars per acre for that farmer to capture carbon. But I think a big point right there is, are we able, and we should be, to measure and verify just exactly what that agricultural crop or that forest or that timberland is actually sequestering, so that a realistic value can be put on that. And that's one of these, that's a great incentive to get farmers and timberland owners, to do what they need to do to sequester as much of these greenhouse gases as possible. So yeah, that's critical in this whole process.
This Robbie again, along forestry, I think it overlaps with ag. There are a lot of emerging markets. You spoke to states. California has their own carbon exchange. It's fairly, I don't want to, it's positive, but it's rules prohibitive, maybe is a better way to say it. From some of the things I've read, there's a private company called Silverterra that will pay timberland owners to have in essence, either reduce their harvest, but have a net timber gain for a year or two. I know our company's looking into it. We haven't participated in it yet, but we've got a consulting looking into it. So one of the thoughts I had was maybe through LDAF or LSU Ag or somebody like that, have a staff position or somebody on staff already to be research all of this, different methodologies, and then translate that into technical assistance for private farmers and private landowners. I said earlier that there's 13 million acres of timberland. I see on the LDAF site that's 13.8 million, and 62% of that is basically owned by what is known as non-industrial private forest landowners, which doesn't, my company and Royal Martin and Weyerhaeuser, probably many of the Hunt family, they may actually come up under more of an industrial, which is somewhere in the 20%. Only 9% of the state is held in like Forest Service or other public trust land. So some type of technical assistance to educate landowners on what's available out there, and stay on top of all these Karen, I know Keith and I talked some time ago about potential projects that the Nature Conservancy had around carbon sequestration. And Silverterra is interesting because they basically take nationwide imagery and calculate change in carbon and measure it. And that's how they propose to see if you have a gain or loss if you sign up in their program.
So to summarize, I think what Ron and Mr. Robbie were saying is have a database of either a verification procedures, and then have someone who's dedicated to, at least, I mean, either on the Ag Center or in the private industry or at LDAF, who can help with putting all these materials together. And going back what Karen mentioned, maybe the state needs a small pilot project, one on the crop side, one on the forestry side, and one on the livestock side, to see how those verification procedures can be validated. And then that will develop a baseline for our farmers to use and base off of. Does that sound reasonable, Joey?
Yes, very.
Wonderful.
And, and I'm looking at our other sector committees, the power sector, transportation sector, the manufacturing and industry sector, the mining and oil and gas sector, reaching out to these sectors just to see how valuable a carbon trading market would benefit them.
Absolutely, Ron. And I think, I mean, the price for that carbon credit will definitely be market oriented. I mean, the buyer and the seller would define that price eventually, but the verification procedures and the pilot projects will help us identify a baseline, I would say, a baseline price to begin with. And then the market will define, if there are two buyers and one seller, then the market will define where that the established price for that carbon would be. But yeah, I agree. I mean, that interaction with other industries will eventually happen.
That sounds like a great program that could be developed, Naveen, the database, and then establishing the baseline price and assisting farmers with utilizing that. And Karen, to your point on the carbon exchange, that would be a great opportunity to work with some other sectors, possibly the economics advisory group on developing that as well, since I know that's a great idea.
Yeah, and I want to add that we don't have to limit that just to a carbon exchange market. We're talking about fertilizer use efficiency, and that runoff and nitrogen loading in the streams causes a lot of problems, and it's really expensive for like water utility, like utility providers for drinking water, and they find it's a lot cheaper to pay farmers upstream to use some of these practices we're talking about here, which are going to sink carbon. And so it has, there's another path to increasing carbon sequestration beyond just a carbon market, but also like a nutrient market. I don't want to just focus on the carbon part of that, because we can get farmers paid to reduce nitrogen runoff on fields or and stuff that also has these downstream benefits, and we could bring in private or public entities that are going to see a cost advantage of doing it that way than putting in the expensive equipment that's going to remove that stuff from their water supply.
In development of a successful program, you have to identify those objectives within a certain geographic area, within a watershed, for instance, or however geographically, but so that those ag producers within that geography will accept it and it will not hurt their bottom line. Because if they cannot make a living doing these practices, it won't work. And the practices, although they're generally the same throughout the state or the nation, our conservation practices, geographically, they're implemented differently. In Southwest Louisiana, where it might be, like Joey talked about, native grasses and forb reestablishment, or in the alluvial valleys where it's bottomland hardwoods, or the coastal plain where it's pine. So separating programs objectively to implement direct practices that will coincide with an ongoing ag operation would be crucial.
Under the item where it has database verification and then also established baseline, would those be could we, the strategy itself, would it be research and development? And then those two would be two tactics under research and development?
Naveen, that was your idea, so I'll let you. We might have lost Naveen, Greg, but I think that's a great idea, having.
Greg, I think you're right. I don't think Naveen or anyone would object to that.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm completely okay with that. I was just reading through it. Sorry, guys.
That sounds great.
And maybe it
So
doesn't.
guys, I'm going to move us.
Go ahead,
Wait,
go ahead,
what do you
Lindsay.
think?
I just keep thinking
I
about
feel-
all this that we're talking about, the practices, the landowner involvement, and essentially selling or trading credits that the landowner will have to contract to do. And having and thinking back to the pilots and whatnots that I've been part of before, we tried to get some of this going. Where it fell through every time was landowner contracting. The contracts were always lengthier than they wanted. Somewhere we need to think about that. Maybe it doesn't have to be mentioned here, but there's so many good ideas here, and I keep getting flashbacks to trying to get landowners to bite into a lengthier contract that would satisfy a carbon buyer. And in Louisiana hadn't happened, and it was one of the biggest challenges we had. And I don't know, maybe that can plug in somewhere. It's too much in my mind to let it go. So whatever I work in, I'm going to stick it in there somewhere. Just wanted to mention it.
I think that brings up an important point too, Joey, is maybe there needs to be an agency that can help facilitate that trade and be as, I don't know, someone who can identify any roadblocks or loopholes that is causing one of the trading partner to drop off. And you know how LDEQ is trying to do the nutrient credit trading. I mean, even though they're starting, but they act as an agency to go facilitate that.
Robbie, I'm sorry, this is Robbie. To Joey's point, the California, I think you have a 100-year commitment or something like that. Joey, I suggest you look at the Silvaterra website.
I've looked at it.
What do you think of it?
I think they all look good. We just need to find a way to put them into practice here. And honestly, Robbie, I spent a lot of time looking at them all. I've spent time with the California Exchange and seen how a lot of other entities are trying to model after it. I don't know if that's necessarily a good idea, but maybe, they have a market, if you will. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, if you look at all these other things, and I think Justin may have alluded to this, but there's climate entities out there. They're just cropping up. Some I like, some I don't. Naveen put me onto a webinar where a few of them, I guess, showcased their wares. And I think everybody had their favorite or least in there. And I guess those kinds of people may have the potential to serve as both the aggregator and broker, if you will, which I think is something that you and Naveen both mentioned earlier. Don't know, but if those are going to be the entities that are going to play those roles and ultimately help to facilitate this on a larger scale to the buyer, they've got their own growing to do as this develops. And we'll see what it turns into. And I'm certainly keeping my eye on them. But yes, Robbie, I have looked at them, and they've done a lot of good work.
Oh yeah, you're much more knowledgeable about it than I am. One of the things that's caught my eyes, a lot of the money back behind it is big tech like Amazon and others. And so not just Silvaterra, but carbon sequestration in general.
Right.
So let's keep moving along to the marginal land strategies. Joey and Robbie, those are great points to raise, but I think can be further fleshed through as you guys are beginning to look at those implementation strategies and can coordinate on that. So I know someone had mentioned marginal land strategies as an overarching strategy, and there are a few different actions listed there, but what are some specific actions that can help us fulfill this marginal land strategy? Some specific policies and programs or pilots that might further that.
Lindsay, I brought that up earlier, but I think we'd be repeating ourselves a lot. I mean, we're covering a lot of these best management practices for lands that would apply to marginal lands as well.
Okay. So maybe
I think in the interest of time, we could.
Soil health?
I mean, ultimately, yeah, you know, marginal lands leach nutrients a little bit more. They poorly drained. You get less return out of it. So if there's an opportunity to sink carbon and there's a carbon market, a farmer would already know that he's not getting a good return on that chunk of land, you know, and working them into that market. They would be the ideal target for it because a marginal land sometimes requires more inputs. So it would lower their input costs, you know, their nutrient management costs, and, you know, the level of effort needed to manage it if it went to some kind of conservation cover, you know, or some other, you know, natural state. So I think we can move on that.
Yeah.
Perfect. So moving on to the forestry section, let's think through some actions relevant to the reforestation and afforestation category that also might tie in. As Colleen mentioned, it's all right if these actions fall under multiple strategies, because that might also connect to forest management.
The main thing is, you know, you get, as I said earlier, you've got a lot of incentives around, you know, getting trees planted, site preparation, and many other activities in forestry. A lot of it's continuing education, and really, without beating the horse we just got through riding, education on sequestration is probably the number one thing that needs to be added to all that.
Mm-hmm.
And as well, Robbie, afforestation can tie easily into marginal land strategies. It's probably been one of the biggest things that we've done here. And I keep thinking about, and it keeps circling back to the pellets, extruders, and biochar and all of that. But thinking, and I think it's a conversation I had with Buck years ago, novel utilization of slash and paper mill fiber. Those are some of the biggest, bulkiest things that come out of the timber industry that do get beneficially used here and there. Fiber, maybe, slash, not as much that is visible. And I don't know if it's something that would fit here or not. Robbie, that would be your call. I just had it in my mind.
I can't speak to all timberland owners, but, you know, as forestry, and particularly for those of us who third-party certified, in fact, I'm in Texas doing an audit on our lands here this week. We reutilize a lot of our slash to stop erosion by, once it's dragged to the log deck, then we ask our loggers to utilize their skidders to pull it back into the woods and put it on their skid trails, particularly in downslope areas.
Yeah.
And it's beneficial to spread it back over the landscape, just from a nutrient availability aspect, as well as it degrades back into the soil. So a slash market, if we got into a biofuel potential, there could be a play there. But I'm just not that familiar. I've seen pictures of machines that bundled up slash and would move it. I think Kyla may have done some of that kind of research with Drax, because one of their charges is to, and I think she mentioned it earlier, is to use a wood waste. So, but again, go ahead.
I'm happy to speak to that. First, I would say I agree with you completely on the importance of that material going back into the forest and providing nutrients, and also being a barrier to erosion on skid trails. So that's very important. But having said that, there's still an opportunity to use some of that material, especially material that might otherwise have been piled and burned, which would be a bad outcome. So I think it's worth considering, but I would say it's a practice that would have to be developed cautiously, as the way we think about it and thinking about sensitive soils, et cetera. But there's a possibility. But I would also say that, talking about the urban waste, that's
Yeah.
a very viable possibility, because that is material that isn't going back in to provide nutrients back into a forest.
Right.
And Kyla, with your work in forestry and with DRAC specifically, what actions do you think are most relevant, maybe across some of these forestry categories? What actions do you think will help fulfill and attain these strategies?
Yeah, well, I have a couple. I would tag on to strengthening the existing mechanisms that we have to support reforestation and afforestation and good forest management. But there's another piece that might be worth trying to get at, and that's the fragmented forests and the small land holdings. As Robbie said, most of our timberland is in private, non-corporate ownership. And with land passing down in generations, land just obviously becomes more fragmented. So we've got a potential good conservation story, as well as a better utilization of a resource. So that's something to think about. And I know, I'm fairly sure the LSU Ag Center, Naveen, maybe you can help me out here, was working on a tool to assist small landowners. And it was like an app that would kind of encourage a cooperative approach to land management. So what it would do is it would help these smaller landholders gain access to harvesting contractors and replanting contractors. And I think that's an interesting concept. I don't know if that's ever came to fruition.
I don't know. I don't know about that, Kyla. I mean, maybe the R&R, someone in the R&R department might be working on it, I guess.
Yeah. It's interesting. And then the other thing that came to my mind is I just had a discussion with a director at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and it's a nonprofit co-op of Black family farmers and landowners. And he has, what he's trying to do is educate and find and provide resources for these smaller. He says the average land holding is about 30 acres for the folks he's working with. So that kind of falls into a similar category. So I just, it might be worth us looking at ways to try to assist these small landowners. So those are a couple ideas. I could keep going. One other thing I might say is, when we're thinking about harvesting woody biomass, I think it's really important to focus on the conservation outcomes that are associated with that as well. Trees are a very emotional thing for people, and they don't grow as quickly as our agriculture crops. And so if we were to move forward and develop any kind of good program around utilization, it's important that we consider the conservation outcomes. And a piece of that might be also, if we're looking at shoring up cost share and state programs, thinking about the BMP and water quality program, just to make sure that stays in step with this encouraging of good active forest management.
Mm-hmm. So Kyla, possibly you and maybe Robbie, I know is also an expert in forestry. Maybe you guys could get together and begin to flesh through some of these actions and work on those together, if that sounds good.
That sounds great. I was gonna reach out to you, Robbie, and see if you wanted to do that.
That's fine. And Kyla, Buck called me this morning and said he wasn't gonna be on the call, and I told him I'd try to call him tomorrow and give him an update. Maybe the three of us could get together on a conference call, or I don't know if your office is in Monroe. I swing through Monroe a lot going down to Louisiana, and in about a week I'll have my second shot. So whatever we need to do.
Okay, sounds great.
Thank you both. So moving us on to conservation, let's maybe look at this across the strategies. We can identify a few actions within, and it'd be great to identify, since we are short on time, to identify some leads of people on this committee that would be willing to think through those actions more and begin to build out what those policies and programs might look like in conservation. So Greg, I know you have some great expertise here, and Justin as well had some ideas under riparian corridors and flow regimes, and Fran, also you had great ideas under the natural carbon sinks. Would you all and anyone else have any ideas on conservation actions, or be willing to spend some time populating that afterwards?
I'll be glad to take a lead on populating that afterwards. Not so much the minimizing loss to forest or prime farmland or grazing land, but the minimize loss and ecosystem restoration.
I'll be glad to help with that as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I'll be glad to work on that.
Thanks.
You can put my name down there too. This is Justin.
Great. And so what I'm thinking is, after this meeting, I'll create a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet, and we can plug in these strategies that we've talked through and the actions that have been discussed so far, and have a name next to each of them as who is assigned out as their homework to build that action. If that sounds all right with everyone, since we may not have time to go back through all of them.
That's good to me.
Perfect.
Good.
On our last category of waste, I know we've talked about a lot of different things that can fall under this category. Yolanda, you probably have the most relevant expertise here, but Joey, I know you've done some work with ag waste reduction.
And I've done that work with Yolanda and her people. So she's plugged in from both directions.
She's the expert.
Yeah. But yes, I can be part of that as well. I'll work with Yolanda on some action strategies there. And yeah, there's a lot of tree debris being dealt with, and it or ash. And the ash basically gets used as a liming material, which is good. Takes a lot more of it to reach base saturation than you would with lime, but at least it's going to a beneficial use largely. But there's a lot more that can come into that. And yeah, I'll be glad to work with Yolanda on it.
Joey, doesn't poultry litter fall into this category?
I'm sorry, say again, Naveen.
Does the poultry litter fall into this category?
It could. It certainly could.
Okay. I mean, I know you worked on a BMP document on that, right? So.
I did, trying to get EPA approval for poultry litter distribution away from areas of high generation to prevent potential surface water impairments from that, and get that stuff into non-impaired or non-nutrient impaired watersheds for an ag beneficial use. And well, as it turns out, some of the high concentration poultry production areas are kind of out of business right now due to the freeze. So, but the point is, yes, Naveen, the concept is on the table. EPA approved it. There's just been none of that for us to do yet, but I think it's coming. And that certainly needs to grow. And I think there's other similar ag wastes that could be treated similarly.
Got it.
Lindsay, this is Ron. Put me on that group.
Ron, on waste?
Yes.
Great.
And,
yeah, Colleen will put you on there.
Joey is right. And you're saying, I don't know, because of the evolution in the poultry industry, where you're having larger houses put on smaller sectors of land and not having available land to put this waste product. And that in itself, I think is going to help create a energy market, if you will, for this product. As Joey mentioned, up in
a great idea.
Our poultry producing area was hit very hard, but these companies still have contracts they have to meet. And the houses that are still structurally sound to produce, those houses will be working 24/7 now with very little break. And what this is going to do, it's going to generate a lot more litter than what normally would be produced. And again, this litter has a value for energy production. And I know there's one farm, a producer in Mississippi that takes his litter and he generates. He produces methane gas, which he in turn uses to run his generator, and he produces just about all the electricity that he needs to run those houses, plus his own residence.
And possibly, Ron, that's an idea that we could, or an example that we could take and pilot in Louisiana. So we'll put you on the waste team to think of how to incorporate that example that you just mentioned. So Colleen, if you don't mind, can we scroll back up to the top, and we'll just assign out over these broad categories who will take this as their homework to begin developing the actions within. So we spent a lot of time on the soil health, conservation, and tillage. It seems like Mike and John and maybe Naveen and Joey, you guys would be suited to start addressing some of these actions. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes.
Okay. And possibly that can incorporate the fertilizer efficiency and water management piece as well. So then on the technical and financial support and education for farmers, many of these ideas, I believe Naveen and Karen and Joey, you all had some great ideas on actions here.
I'll help
Is it
with
okay
that.
would you be
Yes.
all right for tag team?
Yes.
Okay. And Colleen, does that cover all of ours? Okay, and we'll incorporate the marginal land and integrated adaptation as well. So I know we didn't have a chance to go through every strategy and begin to identify actions, but I hope this conversation was helpful to start getting those brain juices flowing in a place where we can all do it together. So I'll share my screen real quick. I just wanted to talk through next steps with you all from today's discussion. And I really appreciate you all being willing to share your expertise and create some of these action ideas. It's really great that we had more than enough ideas to fill this time, and I'm excited to see what you guys can all develop as we move forward. So just walking us through some next steps after this meeting, our next official group time when we'll come back together is in the April all hands cross-sector workshops. So as we had in February, and I mentioned earlier, we want the opportunity to mix it up and bring all the different groups together to where we can work in a cross-disciplinary review way. So what we're thinking is having about 6 different working sessions between an hour and a half and 2 hours that will be organized around some different themes or specific draft actions that you all would like to discuss. And each of you will be assigned to one of those working sessions. There might be 2 or 3 of you from this group that are in one, but you'll only be needed in one of those working sessions. And they'll be scheduled consecutively on a few days in April. So you'll be able to watch the others or go back and watch the live stream of them. And I'll let you know if we need you to present on a specific draft action idea to get some feedback from other groups as well. So with that, I just wanted, for maybe a minute or two, we can talk about what actions or themes might be helpful for the group to have a deeper focus in on these cross-sector workshops. From our discussion, it seems like this might be most beneficial in the emerging markets area, or possibly with biofuels. Maybe those could be 2 big areas that you guys would like input on, but I'll pass it over to our chairs if they have other ideas, or for you members as well.
I'll speak for a second. When Karen, I think, mentioned about having a pilot project or so, let's say if you're talking about cross-sector, we would probably, it would be useful and helpful if one or two industries would step forward and say, okay, I would like to participate in this pilot along with a farming group, so that maybe participate all through, and which would serve as a pilot as well as a verification program, I guess, if I understood the question correctly. And that's my comment on that.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsay, I can't think of anything to add right now. I think you and Naveen covered it well.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I think those are great starting points. And as you have further ideas and as you all are able to dive into those actions more, please do let Colleen and I know if there are areas of further research that come up where you need some expertise or guidance, possibly from another advisory group or a different committee. We can be sure to address that as we move forward. And I'll be working with your chairs, with Karen and Joey, as we approach those April workshops, so that we design it in a way to answer some of these overarching or economy-wide questions that we've discussed today. So before we end our meeting, I just wanted to revisit this meeting schedule and walk through the homework for today, and then how that will set us up for the future discussions. As you recall, the April 30th deadline is both for the public and committee members. So all of the action ideas we discussed today, I'm just asking if you could submit those proposals in the template to the best of your ability. I understand that we might not be able to answer every question on a lot of these ideas, but to the best of your ability, be able to fill out the action proposal template and submit that to the chairs, myself, and then our climate email by that April 30th deadline. And I'll just reiterate, I'll create a Google Doc, as I mentioned today, and share that with you all over the next day or two, and list out the strategies we've developed, the actions within, and then who's tasked out to do each. And again, I'll encourage you to partner with one or two other committee members. We don't want large groups of members working together, but if you think someone else's expertise might be beneficial on your specific proposal, then that's absolutely welcomed there. And so with that, I would just say I really appreciate your willingness to do this heavy lift over the next few months. I know for you all, this will take a lot of outside time and collaboration and identifying other partners who can help build these actions. So we really appreciate it, and know that this is why you were all here and great experts that we need at the table. With that, I'll turn it back over to our chairs.
Well, thank
Lindsay,
you.
I have nothing else to add, but it was brought to my attention, even though we had motions and seconds on approval of the agenda in the previous meeting's minutes, we did not vote on them. So I would just say that unless anybody objects to those motions and seconds, we consider them unanimously approved.
I agree.
Okay.
If that works procedurally, I'm happy to do that. So Lindsay and Colleen, thank you so much for guiding that discussion and recording it. And I thank everyone for this great discussion. I always learn a lot when I listen to the people on our committee. And I guess with that, we need to go to public comment, right?
Mm-hmm. And we do have a few public comments, members, so I'll read them out in the order they were received. Let's see. So our first comment comes from Michael Tritico, and his comment is from the Restore to the Ag and Forestry Committee of the Governor's Climate Initiative Task Force, submitted by Michael, who is a biologist and president of Restore. And his comment reads, Hurricanes Laura, Delta, and Zeta, along with the terrible ice storms, have removed many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of trees from the state. Those trees were of great significance in sustaining climate equilibria. Replacing the lost trees could be a very immediate and practical way of mitigating adverse impacts on climate balances. Emergency funds, such as were announced yesterday by Governor Edwards, coming as a result of the ice storms, which could be one source of initiating a mass tree planting effort. Perhaps FEMA or SBA funds could also be channeled in that direction. Additionally, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality has a program called Beneficial Environmental Projects
which allows regulated entities to offset some of their potentially negative activities with positive attributes to improving environmental conditions. Perhaps one VEP would be the establishment of a fund into which numerous companies could deposit money that would be available for a sustained tree planting program statewide. Which trees would provide the greatest long-term contribution to climate stability? I suspect that the native species such as longleaf pine, cypress, and all the hardwoods such as oak, hickory, pecan, etc., that lined our creeks and rivers would be the ones that nature prefers given our state's baseline soil, water, and meteorological conditions. I see no reason to delay implementation of a restoration of the trees on a grand scale. Thank you for considering this comment. And Kyla and Robbie, since you are both working on our forestry component, I will share with you his comment, Michael's comment, and his contact information provided as well, if you're interested to pursue that.
Thank you.
And members, that is all of the comments that we have received for today.
But that's the only comment. I can only give them out via the conservation districts that operate under the auspices of this department. But we've got cypress seedlings that we're looking to get rid of. So maybe Kyla and Robbie, I'll get with y'all and y'all can hand some cypress seedlings over and he can get them into Southwest Louisiana.
Sounds good to me.
That sounds great, Jody. So with that, I'll hand it back over to the chairs if we have no more public comments.
None. So, and as far as closing remarks, I'd like to echo what Karen said earlier. Thanks everybody for being involved. This committee couldn't do what it's doing without your expertise and commitment. It's very, very much appreciated. And that's all I've got. So with that, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And a second.
Second.
Gotcha. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, Lindsay, I guess we're done here, and we'll get our further marching orders from you.
Get excited for your homework.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.